Let's talk about multiband compression. Easily one of, if not the most powerful and difficult processing that you can apply to a sound. Everyone is familiar with OTT, and yet that seems to be where the buck stops when it comes to what people realize what you can actually do with multiband compression. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll understand enough to properly use multiband compression and how to take advantage of its singularly unique ability to radically alter anything you apply it to, as well as its shortcomings and problems that can arise when misusing it. In order to properly explain multiband compression, you need a solid understanding of normal single-band compression. If you don't feel confident in your understanding, Oversampled just uploaded a comprehensive breakdown of the fundamentals of compression that's under 5 minutes. You can find that using the card in the video corner or with the link in the description. If you're super confident about how compression works, skip the explanation using the chapters or timestamps in the description. For those that don't know, RMS stands for root mean square. You see it everywhere in audio, and that's because it essentially represents the average loudness of a signal. In addition to RMS level, you also have peak level, which is basically the maximum amplitude of the digital waveform. In Ableton, both of these levels are shown on the level meter. The less saturated color represents the peak level, and the more saturated color represents the RMS level. There is also a little bar to indicate the highest value that the peak level reached over the last few seconds, and this number represents the all-time highest peak value. You can reset it by clicking on it. Our ears are less sensitive to sounds that are very short, so the RMS level more accurately represents how quote-unquote loud our mind will perceive the sound. If I play some white noise, you'll notice that the peak levels of both these sounds are very similar, but the white noise sounds much louder. The white noise has higher RMS than the impulse, even though digitally they don't vary much in actual volume, because the white noise sustains for much longer. This is the goal of compression, and why compression makes things sound louder. Compressors, by means of removing the peaks of sounds and also lowers their dynamic range, which is the difference between peak and RMS. I'll use a clipper to demonstrate this. Hopefully you can start to see where we're going, and Standard Clip makes this easy for us. It displays the actual max peak and RMS measurements before and after clipping. Now that we've reduced the max peak volume, we can increase the sound's volume via makeup gain to bring the peak back to where it was before. And Standard Clip offers a makeup gain assistant that will just set the makeup gain amount to the difference that we've reduced it by. Now, this sample has the same digital peak as before, but we have, in effect, only increased the RMS level, which makes the sound feel significantly louder. This is the same process in both limiters and compressors, except that we add latency to allow for digitally smoothing the waveform's individual cycles as they approach the clip ceiling in order to avoid the sound of hard clip distortion and aliasing, also known as soft clipping, as well as slowing down the gain reduction circuit so that, well, actually, the only reason we do this is to emulate the fact that the physical hardware these digital processors are copying also can't react instantly, just like our ears and our speakers. This has the side effect of what attack and release times do to sound, which we've since learned is extremely useful for shaping dynamics. But unless you really understand what's going on, putting a compressor on your master channel or a limiter isn't much different or is even worse than just using a hard clipper. To recap, longer attack means allowing more peak level through, while shorter attack limits those peaks so you can maximize makeup gain in RMS. This is why parallel compression works so well. Most of the signal is natural and dynamic, and adding super limited RMS to it doesn't increase the peaks by very much while adding plenty of loudness. Shorter release will bring you closer to clipping, making the whole gain reduction process closer to audio rate. while longer release times eliminate that distortion by smoothing the process over time. This is why medium release times can sound pumpy after makeup, and why longer release times can sound more gentle. FET compressors, like the 1176, are very fast and sound dirty and gritty because they're closest to clipping. Opto compressors, like the LA2A, are very slow and sound gentle and musical. Very mu compressors have tubes in them which add saturation, and VCA compressors are more modern, have ratio, attack, release, and threshold settings, and sound pretty transparent when used traditionally. And now, you know why, and can make the right choices when you pick a compressor to use for your sounds. So now, you should understand that the goal of compression is more than just to maintain a specific dynamic range. It's also used to convert peak levels into RMS levels, thereby increasing the loudness of a sound. You should also now be able to take information you hear, such as the rule of thumb of aiming for roughly 8 decibel of dynamic range in your final mix before mastering, and know how to put that knowledge into action in a useful way. So that covers the compression part of multiband compression, and now we have to talk about band splitting. Again, if you're familiar with linear phase, crossover slopes, harmonics and partials in synthesis and their relative phase, and the like, feel free to skip ahead using the chapters or timestamps below. Let's start with square waves. You should know by now that all sounds are made up of a fundamental pitch and a series of overtones. Since I'm sure everyone is familiar with Serum, we can visualize this using its wavetable editor. Here's Serum's initial saw wave. Saw waves contain every harmonic, odd and even, decreasing in relative volume the higher in frequency you go, visualized by these top bins in the editor. These bottom bins represent the phase of each harmonic. Keep in mind that each harmonic is just a sine wave relative to one another. Notice that half of all these partials are rotated out of phase, which is why this initial preset has its vertical zero crossing in the center of its waveform instead of at both edges, like in some other synths. This is to align with the fact that Serum defaults to 180 degrees being the waveform starting position instead of 0 degrees. You can set any one frame of a wavetable to specific shapes using this formula menu dropdown. Notice that when I select just saw, the editor loads an unrotated saw wave where all partials are in phase with one another. When I load a square wave, you'll see that square waves contain every other harmonic. Even harmonics only, where this is the fundamental, this is harmonic 1, harmonic 2, harmonic 4, harmonic 6, and so on. Square waves are very significant in digital audio. They represent the maximum possible loudness of any sound. Their peak level and their RMS level are, in theory, equal, since the square is always at either negative or positive its maximum amplitude. The more you hard clip a sine wave, the closer to a square it becomes. You can imagine the floor and ceiling here being negative and positive 0, and these two halves being a sine wave you just continue to increase the gain of until nothing is left but these fully limited peaks. This is why saturation adds harmonics to your sound. You're turning individual sine harmonics more into squares, and why it makes it sound louder, you're increasing the RMS level by clipping. This is at the cost of headroom, however. The existence of harmonics makes it that the fundamental can't be as loud, since they all have to take up the same space. Up to a certain point, this is fine, adding color and loudness to the low end. However, go too far, and you start to lose those fundamentals and end up with a lot of distortion, a la too many square waves in your mix, adding up to a loss of real bass and a cluttered midrange. We can consider a square wave to be the ideal loudness candidate for all digital audio based on its properties. The closer we get to a square wave, the louder our mix will be, but the less pleasant it is to hear. Dan Worrell demonstrated this for us already. So the goal is to strive for a balance between square wave and musical dynamic mix. This is where that earlier figure of about 8 decibels of dynamic range comes from. Go past that, and you risk losing detail and clarity just for the sake of loudness, which isn't really necessary. But back to the main topic. What happens when we start to mess with the phase of this square wave? You should be able to see the individual sine wave fundamental interact with the waveform shape as I begin to rotate its phase relative to the others. Here, the sine's positive and negative maximum are clear, but because it's out of phase, the resulting waveform has an unusual shape. When I rotate it back to roughly about where it was to begin with, you'll also notice something else. The amplitudes of each bin were compensated to be lower than the original. This is because adding all the partials together in such a way would have resulted in the waveform's total amplitude going past its maximum. Keep that in mind for later. Taking another look at this rotated square, you might be surprised to hear that it sounds identical to a normal one. No matter how much we rotate the fundamental. This is why phase issues can be so insidious. At some points, they're practically invisible. But think about what would happen if you applied a clipper to this signal. In fact, instead of thinking, let's do it ourselves. I've put an oscilloscope on the channel so we can monitor what happens to the waveform after the clipper affects it. Sure enough, as I lower the clipping threshold, only part of the signal begins to be affected. This is not what would normally happen to a square wave. Let's switch to a normal square, which I've loaded here in oscillator B. Hear how it's retaining its timbre even after nonlinear processing? This will be the case for every nonlinearity you introduce to a phase-rotated signal, including every form of dynamics processing and distortion. Even if they sound identical at first, the phase-rotated signal will produce different results than the phase-aligned signal. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because phase rotation is the key to filtering. The way filters work is taking an incoming signal, making a copy of that signal, and rotating the phase before adding them both together. How we rotate that phase allows for all sorts of interesting effects like low-pass filters, high-pass filters, band-pass filters, notches and peaks. We can even create brick wall filters by completely inverting the phase, and we can create band splitters that allow us to affect different regions of the sound in different ways. However, now that you've seen what phase rotation does to sounds when different parts of a signal are out of alignment, you likely understand where the issues begin to come in. Let's add a multiband dynamics device to our normal square wave. This splits the signal into a low, mid, and high band that you can compress separately. No compression is actually being done yet, so our sound doesn't seem to change. One look at the oscilloscope, however, and yikes! What a difference! You can see that the waveform changes based on where the band splitter's crossover points are. Indicating that this is in fact a problem caused by rotation due to filtering. Even with no compression happening at all, our clipper is going to affect the sound differently. Let's try introducing real compression into the mix. And of course, we're going with the classic OTT preset. This sounds a lot less like a square already, but still, it doesn't behave the way you'd expect a square should when encountering a limiter of some kind. Now, imagine that instead of a square wave, this OTT is on your mix bus, and this clipper is the limiter on your master. While it's true that if it sounds good, it is good, you might not realize what you're putting your sounds through when you use processing like this. And if you plan on achieving a super loud, super clean mix, this might be one of the invisible problems that has been getting in your way and preventing that super precise, tight sound you're trying to get. Even an EQ will introduce subtle phase rotations, so anytime you use a low-pass filter to eliminate muddy frequencies, you could potentially be adding phase misalignment problems to the important harmonics just above your cutoff frequency. This goes especially for sounds that frequently get a lot of extra processing, such as drums and basses with heavy compression and distortion, and these problems can compound further if you use multiple filter-based effects in series. It's also important to note that while everything I've said is true, these negative side effects are pretty minuscule in the scheme of things, and you shouldn't necessarily obsess over them. It's just important to keep in mind that you could be getting cleaner results by electing to use the proper tools, and that all of those small improvements can add up over time, whether to an increasingly dirty mix or an increasingly clean one. Just be aware of what filters are doing to your mix, especially any heavy-handed ones, like this. You can even hear the pitch of the note changing due to phase rotation. Try to use gentler filter slopes whenever possible for generally better results. So, now you understand compression, and you understand the pitfalls of multiband processing. How in the world are you supposed to even use multi-compression with so much to think about? This is why I think it's one of the hardest effects to get right, and it takes a lot of practice. First of all, the solution to the multiband processing problem is linear phase mode. Here's FabFilter's Pro MB affecting a normal square wave. Again, doing no compression. It has, in fact, only one band that is completely disabled. Here, I've set Pro MB to minimum phase mode, which guarantees as little latency as possible. Notice what happens to our square wave. Same as before, but see what happens when I set Pro MB to linear phase mode. Aha! That looks like a square wave, doesn't it? And our clipper affects the signal as we'd expect it, even after using our compressor to make changes to the sound. What Pro MB is doing is increasing the latency and using that extra time to correct for the rotated signal, so that we can trust that what comes out has the same phase alignment as what goes in. This is where using professional tools earns you professional results, at the cost of latency and CPU, of course. Now, unfortunately, Pro MB cannot completely replace OTT. The reason why comes down to compression modes. Yes, there's even more to compression than what we've already covered. Ableton's multiband dynamics device is actually what is known as a compander, which is short for compressor expander, and it can do both upwards and downwards dynamics processing. To make things simpler, I've disabled the band splitting function of the device, so we only have to look at one band for now. The regular kind of compression you're used to is called downwards compression. This pushes signal above a threshold down towards the threshold, according to a ratio. So in the multiband dynamics device, you change these settings in the above section, labeled here with a tiny a. This is where you set the threshold and the ratio. But you can also do this by grabbing the handle of the rectangle to set the threshold, and by dragging vertically inside to set the ratio. Red means downward, and blue means upward, so downward compression. Smaller lines appear to help indicate how intense your ratio setting is. Upward compression takes audio below a threshold and pushes up to it, like this. This also reduces the dynamic range, but by increasing sounds that are quiet instead. This is a sound you'll be very familiar with if you use OTT often. It artificially sustains tails for quite some time, depending on the intensity. If you're getting too much sustain out of your OTT, try just double-clicking to reset a band and prevent its upward compression. You can even do this in Xfer's version of OTT by control-clicking on one of the bands. Then there's expansion. Downwards expansion is also called gating, where you reduce sound below a threshold according to a ratio, like this. So yes, you can do gating and compression across multiple bands all at once, allowing for some really clean sounds. And finally, there's upwards expansion. This is pretty dangerous, so be careful. It increases the volume of sounds above a threshold, and more so, the higher above the threshold it gets. This can quickly turn into exponential loudness, so be careful and make sure you have some kind of limiter or clipper on to prevent hearing or equipment damage. If you drag on the interface, you'll notice that if you make any of the thresholds collide, they will push the other out of the way. But if you use the panels, you can actually make the thresholds overlap. and in this case, force an upwards compressor into an upwards expander, which can really make things go crazy. Thanks to our clipper for protecting us from about plus 30 decibels of signal. So, what can you do with multiband compression? Well, honestly, at this point, I hope you can grasp just how endless the possibilities are. With a combination of compression, multiband processing, and creative thinking, you can accomplish a lot. Sidechain ducking that only affects the low end of specific elements, and now without any phase rotation causing problems between kick and bass. Try ducking the mid-range with a few bands, and send in a vocal as the sidechain source, gluing your track together while giving the lead the space it needs to really shine. Sculpt the spectral curvature of your basses with extreme ratios and makeup settings, or impart a breathing, pulsing quality to synths using expansion. Try doing inverse compression, making the loud parts quiet and the quiet parts loud. It's really possible. In fact, check out Slate Digital's brand new MOTT, which has negative ratios and a built-in clipper for even crazier sound design possibilities. It doesn't seem to have linear phase or oversampling, unfortunately, but if you're going to go that extreme with sound mangling, you'll probably be okay without. Also, try replacing your typical compressor or glue compressor with the Multiband Dynamics device set to single band mode. Make a preset for yourself for easy access, and experiment with combined gate compression or expansion into compression. You'll find that it's incredibly versatile, fast, and gets unique results from the other Dynamics processors available to you. I know I haven't done a lot of specific examples or techniques, and that this video is quite long, despite the name of the series, but I hope that you can take away a complete understanding of compression and phase, and that this knowledge will pay dividends every time you have to use a compressor in the future. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments, and I'll make sure to answer them as soon as I can. Since this video covered a few different advanced topics, I'm also going to leave some extra links in the description for you all to check out if you're interested. They expand on various different points that I've made, and should help solidify everything I've talked about in this video. Don't forget that YouTube allows you to watch videos at 1.5 or 2 times speed, and I'd recommend you watch everything at least a little faster than normal. You'd be surprised how much time saving that adds up to in the end. Also, be sure to join my Discord if you're interested. I have a collection of a few different resources that you might find useful if you produce electronic music. The link is in the description. I hope you've enjoyed this issue of 10 Minute Techniques. If you want more, subscribe and comment. Here's a link to the playlist. Links to where you can find me are in the description. Thank you, and stay technical.